السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. In the beginning of the Taraweeh, we heard the verse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and in the alternating of the evening and the morning, there are signs لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, for those who think deeply. Now, this verse has a twin in Surah Al-Baqarah, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the sequence of the verses in the same way, but Allah ta'ala mentions multiple things more than the verse that we heard. And at the end of the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah says, لَعَلَّكُمْ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ, that Allah ta'ala says in all of these things, in the alternating of the night and the day, in the heavens and the earth, and the boats in the sea, and the rains that come, all of these are signs for those who use their intellect. لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. But in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives half the list. And then He says, لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, for those who have, al-lub is the heart. So it's important that we think of the first verse in Surah Al-Baqarah to understand the significance of this verse. Now, one of the meanings of the verse is that everything that's around us is a sign. That's one of our beliefs. Everything. In the physical world, also in the social world, in the world of ideas, in the world of events. Everything that we see for the believer is a sign, is a potential sign to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if you see something, God forbid, horrible, or you see something sad, or you see something traumatic, in that is a sign. And then you see something positive, in that is a sign. So one of the skills of the believer is that they see everything as a sign. So every time they see something, they say, La ilaha illallah, for one reason or another. But as you journey closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are less concerned with the signs, and you are more concerned with whom the sign is directing towards. So in the second verse that we heard, there are less things that are mentioned. Because as you become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you need less things. You're not worried about the things, you see only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But to get to that stage, you have to go beyond the rational intellect. لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, for those with hearts. And then Allah defines them, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. How do you become a person of deep thinking? You have to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the intellect is important. Allah gave us the intellect. It's one of the it's the greatest gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. But for us, the intellect is not just a rational process. It is linked to our remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you see the heavens and the earth, if the person is remembering God, if the person is aware of these realities, you say, oh wow, subhanallah. But if you don't remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala often, and then you look at all of these things, you might not pay attention to it, or you might make a wrong conclusion, or you might use your own nafs, your own reason to deduce something negative from it, not positive. How can your thinking be guided? It's guided by your remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in this verse, Allah says, these are the people of ulil albab, these are the people that have a heart. They've gone deeper than simply the rational thinking. They're not looking at something only rationally, only scientifically, only materially, even though those layers of understanding are accurate and true, but to a level, to an extent. But when you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frequently, Allah says they remember Allah standing, sitting and lying down, yani all the time. And if you follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, he remembered Allah ta'ala all the time. There was nothing that he did not have associated with it a remembrance, a dhikr, a dua. So when you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala often, then your thinking is enlightened and deep. And as you contemplate all of the things around you, you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of that. There's a beautiful hadith that's narrated in this about this verse that Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, he came to Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha after the Prophet ﷺ had passed to Ar-Rafiq al-A'la, and she said, tell me something amazing about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So she started to cry and she said, well, everything about him was amazing. But there was this one time where we were getting ready for bed, and I love to be close to him physically, to touch him and that he touches me. And then in that moment of intimacy, he asked my permission if he could stand and pray. And I said, Wallahi, I love your intimate touch, but I love what you love even more. So I give you permission to stand and pray. So the Prophet ﷺ stood and he began to pray. And she said he started to pray and he started to cry until I saw the tears surrounding where he was standing, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Until Bilal came in and knocked and said, Ya Rasulullah, it's time for prayer. And then he saw him crying. He said, Ya Rasulullah, how could you be in this? How could you be crying? Well, Allah Ta'ala has forgiven you your previous sins, all sins, you're infallible. And then he said, how can I not cry when this evening it was revealed to me this verse, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لَأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. How can a believer think of this verse, read this verse, and not contemplate on the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? One verse, this whole story is just from this one verse. The Prophet ﷺ was captivated by that verse and what it stood for. So this is a reminder for us to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala frequently, often, and have that guide our thinking so that inshallah our thinking is enlightened, our thinking is deep, and it's not shallow, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.